D&D is filled with terrifying monsters that will eat a person at the drop of a hat. But we're humans. One of our core character traits is a willingness to befriend anything, from inanimate objects to monsters that want to eat us for lunch. Today I want to discuss a D&D creature that I believe would be among the first monsters domesticated by people, and that very well may change the course of civilization's development. The Rust Monster. There are a few things that make this creature uniquely positioned to be domesticated in D&D. First, it's a medium creature that doesn't have a specified expected alignment, which usually means that the creature is fairly pragmatic and doesn't have a fixed trait of cruelty or charity. Being a medium creature means that it can also be a very good mount for creatures of small size or lower, like goblins, kobolds, halflings, and some small humans. And having no fixed alignment indicates to me that this creature likely has no compunctions about working for food, which is among the first steps of domestication. They're also very stupid. The Rust Monster stat block boasts an intelligence of just 2, and the lore description in the 2014 Monster Manual describes them as chasing after ferrous metals and ignoring creatures that aren't carrying them, which indicates also that they have very few survival instincts when presented with their favourite food. Indeed, the same Monster Manual states if they are well treated and well fed, they can also become friendly companions or pets. Rust monsters consume as their diet ferrous metals, which not only includes iron, iron alloys, steel, but also mithril and adamantine. They consume it by first rusting the metal, either through contact with their body in the sense of a weapon hitting them, or with their antennae, as long as they can see the object within 5 feet of them. They also have an uncanny ability to sniff out and pinpoint where any ferrous metals within 30 feet of them are. I choose to believe that this sense is somewhat supernatural, allowing them to sniff out iron and its related ores through rock. This does impact a little bit of what we're discussing, but not a lot. So what we essentially have here is a man-sized armoured bug that is hyperfixated on ferrous metals, not capable of complex thought, and yet very capable of friendship and companionship if treated well. Furthermore, rust monsters don't have a burrowing speed, so they're going to be particularly bad at digging through rock and stone, which usually hides all of the good stuff anyway. So any creature that can dig out the stone in between them and their favourite snacks may find themselves a beneficiary of a very useful symbiotic relationship. Oh, and also they're innately excellent at sniffing out 2 very, very rare forms of magical metal in D&D's world, and also have a faster movement speed on the land than all humanoids. Before the 2nd millennium BC, in our real world, it was highly impractical to try to smelt iron. Before this time, most of the iron that was used in human tools came from meteorites that had fallen to the earth. It was that hard to get a handle on crafting with iron that we didn't enter the Iron Age until 1200 BCE. After the Kingdom of Sumer, the Babylonian Empire, many of the Egyptian kingdoms and many, many more had already risen and fallen. So much of ancient human history occurred without ferrous metal being particularly useful at all. And so using it as a food source for man-sized armoured bugs that are 10 times tougher than the average humanoid commoner seems like a bit of a no-brainer for any culture that has not yet figured out what to do with the stuff. After all, bronze is non-ferrous and served perfectly well for our ancestors. I mean, really, bronze is a better material to work with than iron anyway. The only trouble is it's far less abundant to find its constituent parts in the earth, and it requires you to make an alloy as opposed to just smelting an ore. This is all to say that if we see a technological development timeline similar to our real world in any fantasy world, taming a rust monster is essentially without cost. As far as I can tell, they don't even eat human foods, or any foods that we would feed to other domesticated creatures. Their main diet is rust. But so what? Sure, we can have big, tameable, armoured beetles in the ancient past of our world, but Surely, once we start finding uses for iron and its likely abundance and plenty in this particular world, surely the rust monster would get quickly left behind. Well, no. First off, we need to consider the fact that progress, especially technological progress throughout history, is never linear or indeed unilateral. While ancient cultures do tend to mirror each other's developments to some extent, using the joint mechanisms of trading goods and trading ideas to do so, certain groups, societies or cultures don't take to, adopt, or even find use for other cultures' developments. The Chinese, famously, weren't particularly interested or competent at making glass until the 17th century, despite it being a mainstay of other civilizations for hundreds of years, especially in containing volatile fluids. Therefore, we don't need all of the cultures in our fantasy worlds to engage with ferrous metals, even in an age of guns and steel. Frankly, for all the world's civilizations to be using the same iron and steel armaments is more of a reach. Besides, D&D's druids have historically been very clearly associated with their refusal to use smelted metals at all. Not that this is particularly inspired by the druids of history, that is. But in D&D, societies for whom druids are leaders or gurus may choose to adopt this lifestyle or material fashion as well. Maybe even to stick with the old ways, they use rust monsters to enforce this right as well, sniffing out any rogue elements of ferrous metals in their communities, just to ensure they can stay pure. In addition, creatures not traditionally associated with fire, smelting or metalcraft, like orcs, goblins and wood elves, may also still have use for rust monsters in a modern age. Indeed, the more ubiquitous iron and steel become, the easier it is to use a rust monster if you're one of these insular communities that refuses to use ferrous metals, to sniff out traitors and spies within their midst. For a culture that uses iron or steel, it can often be very difficult not to use these materials in their crafts. In knives, studs, nails, horseshoes, the list goes on. Even if you're disguising yourself as a member of a non-ferrous metal using species or society, a rust monster would very easily sniff you out, which might have the added benefit of making the traitor's wagon completely fall apart, as it was being held together by iron nails, for instance. I would argue that in areas replete with rust monsters, naturally, either due to remaining cultural uses or historic breeding having gotten out of hand, traditional carpentry and joinery would be the done thing. Using iron to secure important fastenings, or as nails, would be arrogant indeed in an area that is infested with rust monsters. As I just mentioned, your wagon could literally fall apart on you if you're surprised. It is this feature, their civilization-destroying potential, that ironically makes the rust monster so useful for civilizational potential and world building, even in an age that uses ferrous metals commonly. The creature is clearly designed in its original form to mess with adventurers. Their shining swords and sparkling armour become the creature's food and become a different way that the monster can mess with a party. Its mechanical function is to exist as a problem in combat, sure, but there are two other ways in which the rust monster, I think, is arguably more useful in a fantasy world than even in combat. It is, though, important to mention combat uses, which we'll be doing first. Since rust monsters are specifically designed to avoid any creature that isn't carrying ferrous metal, a non-ferrous society could easily just release these creatures out onto a battlefield in the assurity that even untrained, they won't attack their side first. They'll attack their enemies, who are wielding plate armour or iron swords. Dwarfs especially, known for their affinity for smithing and rare metals, are described rightly as terrified of rust monsters. And at war, the release of such creatures on their unsuspecting ranks would cause havoc and bedlam. As this chaos ensues, the rust monsters will be going around opening up gaps in the dwarven armour, which is almost certainly going to be made out of some sort of ferrous metal. allowing for weaker or lighter piercing weapons to make their way past what would have been impenetrable plate, perhaps. We may even see certain Dwarven armies completely refusing to go to battle wearing mithril, adamantine, or even steel. Ancestral crafted armour is too valuable to potentially waste just in case the enemy has rust monsters. Bronze-clad armies of dwarfs marching across the plains would certainly be a sight to behold. And it does really make sense for dwarfs to therefore leave behind any non-magical ferrous ancestral armours or armaments at home if heading out to battle with an enemy that they do not fully understand yet. Just the threat of a rust monster could cause an entire enemy army to not use its toughest materials for its armour. So how can rust monsters be any more useful than as a dwarf deterrent in any post-Iron Age world? Well, as pigs and as crowbars. Hear me out. Truffle pigs are perhaps the best modern analogue for a rust monster. They are animals trained to use their exceptional senses to find objects of great value, mostly because they really like eating said objects. As much as dwarfs may detest rust monsters on the battlefield, even they must begrudgingly acknowledge the creature for its ability to sniff out some of the rarest and most powerful metals in a D&D world. I find it hard to believe that any civilization wouldn't give up a little bit of iron to have a magic sniffer bug that can smell any veins of adamantine or mithril in the area. So I can really see rust monsters being deployed as part of mining operations as well, kept away from the tools, of course. Thankfully, rust monsters are also reasonably stupid, so you don't need to worry too much about them escaping from wherever you're holding them and then eating up all of your ores and pickaxes either. I would also contend that any exploration of some ancient ruin should have a team that ensures that, while carrying no metal, they take a rust monster, allowing it to search for arms, armaments, iron, steel, and the legendary metals. It's something of a sacrifice not to carry anything ferrous on you except maybe a few treat balls of iron ore, but the potential benefits, I believe, outweigh the cost. Directional help, aid in finding mechanical traps, and indeed any particular valuable items that you may be searching for above others, especially in a world where mimics often pretend to be treasure chests. Treasure chests which would usually have iron hinges and locking mechanisms, for example, allowing you to be suspicious if the rust monster isn't interested in them. I find it likely that rust monsters would be able to distinguish between a real chest or real wardrobe and a mimic, and that they might even be useful in fighting against animated armours or iron golems, who are common protectors for ancient vaults. Although, technically by 5e's wording of the rust monster, both animated armour and an iron golem would count as magical ferrous creatures, not non-magical ferrous objects, and so both are, weirdly, technically immune to all of the rust monster's powers. This was not necessarily the case in earlier editions of the game, which was arguably more fun. But speaking of destroying mundane objects, let's look at what I believe to be the most impactful effect of a rust monster existing in a post-iron world, as a multi-purpose crowbar. What do hinges, padlocks, bars and latches all have in common? They're all used to secure things, and they're all traditionally, at least through most of modern history, made of ferrous metals. Steel is just so damn useful in applications such as these, because it's more durable than most pure metals and more durable than brass as well, can be treated fairly easily against natural degradation and erosion by including carbon in its makeup, and it is far cheaper to make than bronze. And this is talking about modern methods. In those pseudo-medieval worlds that are so often the case in D&D, iron was king. Not necessarily because it was better than bronze, as we've discussed, but because it was cheaper, more abundant, and easier to work. Blacksmiths, not the only types of smiths, are so common in fiction because iron was such a common material and they were always in demand in most towns and villages. They mostly worked with iron throughout their entire professional lives to make nails, horseshoes, and fittings. Really, using anything but iron in a pseudo-medieval fantasy setting would result in either a far more expensive material being used or a far less durable material being used. This is all to say that I believe that in most D&D worlds, as long as they have a similar distribution of metals and ores as our real world, we would still see ferrous materials being used in locks, in hinges, in latches, and all the important parts that people use for their security. As such, a trained rust monster is a nearly perfect break-in tool. Rusting away the hinges of a door or safe in mere seconds with a rust monster is far quicker and quieter than using a crowbar. I can see gangs of smaller folk riding rust monsters through the night, hitting house after house in unsuspecting sleepy towns, rusting doors off their hinges, catching them and laying them down on the ground, and then ransacking the home for valuables very quickly, using the rust monster essentially to open anything that is locked inside as well. All the while having in their back pocket a big, tough, massive beetle to have their back as some sort of enforcer, tank, or even a massive deterrent if the city guard shows up in proper armour, or some steel-plated knight steps up to save the day. A trapped lockbox too tough to open. Rust monster. A 3-foot thick steel bank vault. Rust monster. Need a way out of prison? Rust monster. Adventuring party? Decked out with brand new expensive armour, weapons and shields? Rust monster. With all these uses, in my book, the rust monster should sit at the centre, the confluence of the collective consciousness of an entire fantasy world. Either as feared enemy, defensive ally, massive pain, criminal multi-tool, spy catcher, or miner's best friend. They should fill public consciousness as well as the history of civilization, and should get far more attention in D&D world building than they do. I mean, goodness me, the new 2024 Monster Manual barely has anything to say on these wonderful, wonderful creatures. And I think that's a shame. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeonmaster. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.